Adventures in Consciousness by Jane Roberts, Chapter 15. The following example of what I mean was mentioned briefly in Rob's notes in The Nature of Personal Reality, a Seth book, but I'd like to discuss it more fully here. At the time, Seth was producing that book, and I was writing my book of poetry, Dialogues Between the Soul and the Mortal Self in Time. One day, I was in a particularly high period of inspiration and ended with a verse in which the soul tells the mortal self about a double light that unites both our worlds. Rob and I expected company later that evening. After dinner, he went to the store for wine and crackers while I cleaned up the kitchen. It had rained all day, and when I finished the dishes, I opened the kitchen window, wondering if it was raining too hard for me to take a short walk. Suddenly, I stood transfixed. The night was dark velvet soft, but all shining as the streetlights glittered on the wet sidewalks. A puddle directly beneath the window caught my attention. I stared. The raindrops seemed to rush out of it as much as in. It was a living creature, shooting raindrops like porcupine needles. Streetlights were drawn irresistibly into the fluid silvery skin. It looked like a bush of rainy stems and light blossoms, and as I watched, it stood up and walked. One of the most astounding things I've ever seen. I knew that in the usual world, only a flat puddle lay in the parking lot. I also knew that through my physical senses, I was somehow seeing this other aspect of reality, in which the puddle was a rain creature, alive, alert, and filled with energy. I saw it walk, form itself from the puddle, and thicken. It was ridiculous to ask which was real, the creature or the puddle. Both were, but the creature was far more intriguing. While I was fully perceiving the rain creature, though I knew that anyone else focused in the usual state of consciousness would only see a puddle, and I knew that in the usual world, puddles don't stand up and walk. In that framework, if I said they did, I would be considered mad. But as I looked at the fantastic, glittering creature, I also knew that the puddle was a flat, colorless, unimaginative rendition of something else, quite as valid. I also knew that if I went outside, the rain creature wasn't about to chase me down the street, because the two realities, while connected, were separate, operationally. As I stood there, really dazzled, something else happened. A sudden, round, unmoving yellow light appeared waist-high in the air in front of me, by the refrigerator. It hadn't come from any place that I could see. There was no lightning, for example, but there was no physical counterpart for it, as the puddle was the counterpart for the rain creature. The light was physical, but in our terms, it had no right to be there. It was a perfect, flat circle of light, large and wider than the refrigerator. It didn't bleed outward at the edges or illuminate the rest of the room. Light in a different order of existence. I was so startled by it that I leapt back involuntarily, and it vanished at once. Quite honestly, I don't know where it came from. I'm convinced that it wasn't the reflection or hallucination. I think that in some way it was an event from that other order of reality, that symbolically it represented the light that unites our worlds. Both events, the rain creature and the light, ended up in dialogues. They were used as creative material, which is an excellent way of correlating perceptions that transcend any one order of events. Art, it seems to me, is certainly a method of uniting various aspects of reality and presenting them to our world. Writing dialogues, I moved constantly between the two orders of events, using the state of usual inspiration as a connective. While immersed in that other reality, for example, I found that it's difficult to communicate, and the creative inspiration serves as a bridge between the two worlds, allowing for artistic translation. Once, when writing poetry, for example, I sensed huge figures standing around the rim of the world, their waists treetop high and their shoulders far above in the distance. I didn't rush out into the street yelling, "People, look at these giants." At the same time, I knew that they represented benign consciousness, giant-sized by comparison to our own. And as that feeling swept over me, I couldn't continue with the poem because the events themselves went beyond that kind of awareness. This episode is later discussed in this book. The main thing is this. It is extremely important that we recognize that two orders of events are involved in such cases. Most likely, the faces seen by my students around the ceiling in the class one night, as described in Chapter 1, belonged to this inner world. They were valid. They did exist, but in reference to something else, some other reality that we translate into sense terms or pseudo-sense terms in order to perceive it at all. If I had insisted on the physical existence of my rain creature, for instance, and tried to superimpose its reality over the reality of the puddle in our world, then I would have been in trouble. If I'd run out into the street to encounter it more directly as an entity in our fact world, then I would have been forced to fit it into a world in which it did not belong. If I had paranoid tendencies, I could have projected upon it all the scorn I felt directed against me. I could fear it. I could fear it would attack me. Or, seeing a neighbor, I could try to convince him of the rain creature's reality, insisting that it was real. Of course, it was real, but not in our recognized order of events. Some people find it easier than others to change the focus of their consciousness in this way and to perceive these other events. Few seem able to correlate them with normal life, however. I've only lately begun to study them myself, and so far, all I'm sure of is that these events are indistinguishable precisely because they don't fit into the recognized sequence of official reality. I do not know that when we confuse the two kinds of events, we're in trouble. We become disoriented in our world. Our behavior becomes inappropriate. Perhaps I can explain what I mean more clearly by giving two examples of such behavior. Both involved people who were in mental institutions briefly. Both had read the Seth books and just about every other psychic book on the market. The first episodes concerns a young man I'll call Ed from the West Coast. He called me on the phone one day to tell me that he was Christ and that the world was going to end in a few days. He'd just been released from the mental institution where his parents had put him after he'd seen visions and heard voices that told him he was Christ. His stay at the hospital was brief. Ed was sane enough to figure out that he was there because he said he was Christ. So he stopped saying it. Instead, he agreed with his parents that he'd been exhausted from his college studies. So he was released. But he was still convinced that he was Christ, reincarnated. He said that the world would end on February 2nd. Yet he asked for confirmation from me. Had Seth said anything about it? And since he was sure that he was Christ, he took it for granted that Rob and I would drop everything and fly to the state in which he lived to meet him. In fact, he let me know that I was lucky to have such an opportunity. I tried to tell him about the inner and outer order of events, to explain that he may have received some very vital private information from that inner order, that he then symbolized it. And now he was trying to make the symbol literal. In Christian terms, each person is a part of Christhood. I suggested that he'd had mystical experiences in which he felt the oneness, and recommended that he leave it at that. Recognize his personal Christhood as subjectively valid. See it as a reality in one order of events that could be stated only symbolically in our world. I further suggested that he live his Christhood by being kind to himself and others, but not by trying to impose a literal Christhood upon physical reality. We have to treat the orders of events differently, I said. But the inward order and the outward order are not one. No, are one. Sorry, I read that wrong. Let me read that again. But the inward order and the outward order are one. There's only a unity, he exclaimed impatiently. Astute comment, and quite true. But he was trying to superimpose one kind of reality over another kind and interpreting one kind of information from the inner orders of terms of the outer one. He hung up, still convinced that he was Christ. Perhaps he was a little less sure than he had been. Obviously, the world didn't end when he said it would, though. So maybe that made him think twice. Ordinarily, the focus personality picks up the main station, but turning its perceptive abilities just slightly off its living level, it can pick up other realities. The living level, presenting the focus personality's direct intersection with the space-time field, is the strongest station. Other signals must be interspersed with home signals or appear as meaningless static. So these other perceptions, color or tint, are usual experience. The difference between normal events and other events is what gets our notice. The unofficial perceptions tell us that something different is happening, but the data are still coming through our home station, superimposed to some extent on our program in quotes. When this happens, the resulting translation gives us events squeezed out of shape to some degree, like objects trying to fit into a space too small or cramped. A sort of dimensional dilemma results. The new data push events as we know them slightly out of shape, even while they must be imprinted or impressed on experience as we understand it. Since the focus personality is involved with its living level home station, the information comes through the local program, altering it to some extent. But the creative material that's being changed in the psychic content, the beliefs, symbols, ideas, and intents of the conscious mind interprets the data. Let me read that sentence again. But the creative material that's being changed is the psychic content, the beliefs, symbols, ideas, and interests of the conscious mind that interprets the data. And I'm going to pause here because she goes into the second example.